Welcome back, everybody. In our previous lecture, we spent a lot of time talking about the general structure of this class, how the material was going to be presented, some expectations that were placed on you, and eventually how you were going to be graded in this course. And what we're going to be doing in this second lecture for this module is focusing our attention on the material itself. We'll be discussing the general framework for how we're going to be going about addressing lifespan development topics in the class, and we're going to be talking about some overarching ideas that you want to keep in mind as we progress throughout each topic within the class. In particular, we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about how the information in this class will be divvied up into the four different sections that we talked about earlier. To better clarify some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this class, we're also going to be spending some time in this lecture talking about some really critical research concepts and ideas that developmental psychologists use when they're trying to explore the multitude of different topics that people in developmental psychology do study. Another thing I want to do in this lecture is talk about some things that I want you to keep in mind as you're tackling all the new material. Because if you can think about these things the same way that developmental psychologists do, you can have a better understanding of not only the material itself, but the context around the material that we're going to be discussing. So let's get started. One of the best ways I've found we introduce students to this topic is to have them break out into groups and do kind of an odd activity. This activity asks students to think about the youngest version of themselves that they have a clear recollection of. And what I ask people to do when this is an in-person class is, after spending a minute or two thinking about that person, share with the person or person sitting around them some of the things about that person and how those things about that young you was different from you now, and how there's still some overlaps between the older you now and the younger you that you could remember. This usually breaks off into a bunch of different conversations that steer in a lot of different directions. Many students tend to find this pretty comical and actually entertaining, to the point where I've had students in the past tell me they went home and did the same thing with their roommates or family members. But it gets at a really critical thing, no matter what path students take when they're doing this. It gives us this sense that when we look at our youngest selves, even though we think of ourselves as being a relatively stable person from day to day, we've all undergone quite a bit of change. Sometimes that change completely shifts us. Other times it just creates some minor quantitative changes in things like physical traits or mental abilities. But when we talk about that change, we're getting to what developmental psychologists are particularly interested in. And to understand what it is that developmental psychologists focus on when studying that change and that unfolding process, I then like to bring up an analogy that I have created and had read things related to many, many years ago, something that actually predated the new concept of snowflakes that unfortunately has been kind of thrown into the, I guess you could say, political stratosphere. So I promise this is not a political thing that I'm trying to get at here when I ask everybody to imagine themselves as being snowflakes. And I always tell students, if you're thinking about yourself as a snowflake, what's one of the things that you always hear about, even if you're, say, in California or Florida, not necessarily in a place where you see a lot of snowflakes? And eventually somebody comes up with a sheepish answer of, well, I know that no two snowflakes are alike. And I always, of course, push back a little bit on that and ask how you could possibly know that, right? Is there somebody out there that's actually taking slides of snowflakes and trying to compare and contrast them? But that's just more for humorous effects, because there is a really key element to that statement that I want us to focus on when we talk about what developmental psychologists do. Most people tend to think that developmental psychologists just lump us all together into specific groups. It's not necessarily true. Developmental psychologists tend to think of people as snowflakes, each one of them being relatively unique. But they also approach these snowflakes in the same mentality of any researcher, where we talk about how even if people are unique, we can still find underlying principles that shape critical components to our formation and probably shift large numbers of individuals in similar ways. If we're studying snowflakes, we could talk about things like altitude and moisture levels and wind and all of these other components that do play a pretty critical factor in some of the things that form when snowflakes, or I guess, impact the way snowflakes form. And the same thing is true for human beings. Certain points in our life, certain elements to our development, when things happen, how they happen, all of those things impact our trajectory. And what many developmental psychologists do is either look at those things themselves or look at the path of change and how different components could possibly shift how individuals are developing and becoming the person that they are. And this can allow us to look at snapshots at different points in our lives and have a better understanding of how we came about to be the person we are on multiple levels, be it physical, mental, or social emotional. And this is really what is at the heart of developmental psychology, this focus on change and the sources of that change. Now, in early developmental psychology, most individuals in the field focused on just coming up with a roadmap for how people developed, how we could explain our transition from infancy into childhood, into adolescence, into adulthood, and beyond. Eventually, though, people started focusing their attentions on those things that created kind of atypical development. And these new picked interests not only gave us a more complete story of the wide range of people that exist in the world, but they gave us a better understanding of where the sources of some of the change we're experiencing are actually coming from. We can also talk about how if certain things happen at certain points or don't happen at certain points, people might be put on a completely different path than what most of our early developmental psychologists were studying. And all of these things in combination give us a much broader, more complex description of how each of us come to be who we are now and who we will be 10, 20, 30 years from now as we continue this unfolding process that lasts all the way from the first moment of conception, when we're a cell that we're going to talk about in our next class called a zygote, all the way to the last seconds of our life. So how do developmental psychologists study these topics then? Well, we're not going to spend an entire class talking about research methods, even though the book goes into a decent amount of detail on it. But I do want us to make sure that we at least have a general understanding of some of the research approaches that are used by developmental psychologists. One of the things that we can do to understand how people change is run what's called comparison studies, where we maybe manipulate certain groups and see how they're impacted by something versus another group. Or we just look at two different groups, either different ages or groups coming from different places or groups that have experienced different things, and look at how they're different from each other as a result of these experiences. These are what we call comparison studies. Now, if we're actually running manipulations, which is not that common in developmental research, we're running what's called an experiment. If we're merely comparing groups to each other on some variable of interest, we're running what's called an observational study. Technically, experiments are kind of comparison studies, and observational studies are kinds of comparison studies. So they're under the same umbrella. But the big difference between these two is that experiments do involve some type of manipulation, which gives you the ability to talk about something which is really critical in research called causation. In developmental psychology, determining causation is oftentimes a bit more challenging than it is in some of the other areas of psychology. So we usually run large numbers of observational studies, hoping with enough evidence that we can start to conclude that there's a probability of causation even if we don't have the experimental control that certain other branches of psychology have. But in rare cases, you will see an experimental study run in developmental research. Another very common thing that's done in these developmental research studies is what we call a correlational study. The most common one is when we just look at somebody's age and compare them on some variable of interest, as you can see here on this slide, indicated by some random variable x. It could be age by height, or age by performance on some test, or age by reactions to something. But when we're just looking at two numbers, your age and your score on something, you can get something called a correlation coefficient and start to talk about the overlap between specific variables as we progress throughout our different moments of life. There's also studies that get away from just looking at age and instead focus on a specific age group and look at how two variables within that age group are correlated. A classic example of this, which we'll talk about later on, is when we look at transitions in things like hormones or body chemistry and how those things impact specific traits at different ages. All of this stuff is, again, what developmental psychologists are using to better understand the unfolding process that we go through, and understanding the terminology related to it can better help you understand some of the implications that researchers can make from the stuff they look at. One last type of study that's important to mention, because it is a real critical player in the early onset of research on specific topics, are these things called case studies. As I mentioned before, most early theorists in developmental psychology tended to focus their attention on just coming up with a roadmap for how we unfold in our lives. But eventually, developmental psychologists started looking at what we call the atypical individuals, ones who weren't following a traditional trajectory. And what they would do is study large components of who they were and how they became the person they were, to better understand the typical unfolding process for most individuals and the unfolding process that occurred for these people of interest. And this gave us, again, a much broader understanding of this broad field of developmental psychology, and it potentially gave us the ability to understand people who didn't follow the traditional path. Now, as I mentioned in the last slide, I don't want to spend the entire class talking about research and specific approaches. I feel like that's oftentimes covered way too much in a lot of our psychology classes and in lots of research methods classes that you take later on. But I do feel it's really important, before we leave this kind of focus on research terminology, to talk about one other classification of studies that's really, really important to understand if you want to understand how developmental psychologists understand what it is they understand. I said understand a lot on that. Anyway, one other classification that's really important is the difference between what we call cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies. If I wanted to look at how age was related to some particular variable of interest, I could potentially just grab people of different ages and measure them on that variable, assuming that any differences that I found in the averages between those groups were related to age. But there's a big concern when we do that type of research, and it's this potential for something that we call a cohort effect. In essence, each age group that we look at as they're progressing are called cohorts. These cohorts, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, do go through the natural unfolding process, but they experience certain things that are sort of unique to their group. They experience certain things that happen in their environment, in their timeline, that are maybe unique in comparison to other groups when they were experiencing certain things at that exact same age. So if we find differences between the different groups, the different age groups that we're measuring at the same time, some of the differences we find might be related to age, but they might also just be related to the unique experiences that each age group had at certain points in their life, hence the term cohort effects. So some researchers in developmental psychology focus their attention on what we call longitudinal studies, where they'll follow one group for a long period of time to see how they change on our variable of interest over that span of time. The issue with running these longitudinal studies is that even though we avoid cohort effects, we do run into other problems that are almost as daunting. Oftentimes, when we run longitudinal studies, we're not interested in just short spans of time. We may be interested in changes over a decade or a couple decades that people are experiencing. And more often than not, when we study people for a long period of time, they don't always want to stay in those studies. It's very easy to get a group of college students to come and participate in a study if you ask them a bunch of questions, but following up with them, say 10, 15 years later, and then another 20, 30 years later, is probably going to be significantly more daunting. This creates what we call attrition issues, where we sometimes lose so many people from time one to time two that some of the effects that we find might be more a byproduct of who's willing to stay in than the changes that we're experiencing. Another big problem with this is that oftentimes researchers don't have the time or the financial ability to follow groups for that long. It's very tough for graduate students to run longitudinal studies knowing that they're only going to have about 5 to 6 years in graduate school to follow up with people. So many researchers try to find some happy medium. One of the more common things that people can do is actually run what's called a cross-sectional longitudinal study, where you combine the two. You study, say, 3, 4 separate groups, but follow them for a span of time, looking at how all of the groups are changing within that span of time, essentially filling in some gaps, giving you a sense if some of the differences you're finding are also indicated in the trends that are existing within the groups over the smaller time span that you're looking at. It can help control for cohort effects, can help control for attrition issues, and can cut down on the time you need immensely. The cost is still an issue. There's other factors that come into play, but hopefully by discussing this stuff, you can have a better sense of not only some of the tools that are at the disposal of developmental psychologists, ones that are really critical within this field, but also some of the discussion that developmental psychologists have when people use these tools. Because there is debate within the field as to what the best approach is and what the findings people get actually imply based on some of the concerns that come along with each of the different designs that can be run. All right. And now that we've talked about the different research approaches that developmental psychologists use, I also want to spend just a few minutes talking about the philosophy that developmental psychologists carry with them when they go into their research. One of the big critical assumptions of developmental psychologists that I want you to keep in mind is that when they look at development, they don't see it as something that goes to some finish line. Many researchers, regardless of which specific area that they're interested in, focus their belief on this notion that development is constantly happening. Change is constantly happening throughout our entire life. Because these things are happening throughout our entire life, it's not often just on one easily predictable path. It's what we call multi-directional, where there's ebbs and flows and rises and falls. It's all the different elements to who we are, both in the cognitive world, social world, and in the physical world. And this is the last big general assumption that developmental psychologists hold, is that when we're talking about change, it's very multifaceted. Somebody might be interested in personality changes that we experience throughout our life, but they understand that when we're talking about changes in personality, it's not just the trait that's changing as we age. There's components to the brain that are having an impact, cognitive skills that change along with age. And all of these things are not only things we can study on their own, but there's an interplay between them that allows for a much kind of more complex story to an individual than we might think when we just study one thing. As a developmental psychologist, people looking at it, there's an acute awareness that these multifaceted components need to be considered when trying to understand the change that somebody's undergoing. And this brings me to the last big component to the assumptions of developmental psychologists. It's that development is contextual. What does that mean? Let's explain on the next slide. When we say that development is contextual, what it means is that there's lots of different factors that are at play when we talk about the things that are changing you. We know that in certain ages, certain things do happen for individuals. But we also know that things like historical events that could occur when we're at specific ages can impact the trajectories or specific things that are supposed to happen for individuals. We also have become acutely aware over the last few decades that the cultures people are coming from can greatly impact some of these paths that we thought were steadfast for everybody. Numerous studies have shown that changes in cognitive skills, physical skills, are highly dependent upon the environment that somebody is raised in. And nowadays, when a developmental psychologist tries to better understand how a person becomes the person they are, we recognize the need to look at some of the cultural impacts that are there when trying to understand where a person's at in their path in life. Another thing that needs to be considered is that, again, just like we talked about with the snowflake analogy, each person is unique, and each person's individual life experiences can have an impact on where they're at on a lot of different things. So we can talk about how most people move in a specific path, but many developmental psychologists are extremely cautious to say that we should say a person is exactly at point X at some point in their life, because there's this recognition that there are so many micro experiences and things going on that can shift us, that being able to predict something like that with certainty is folly. It's dangerous, because there's very rarely that they can guarantee chance that we can assume that somebody is where we think they should be with all of the factors that are at play in everybody's life. So how are we going to tackle this giant mountain of developmental psychology that we've been talking about here? Well, as I've mentioned earlier in the last class and earlier portions of this lecture, what we're going to do is try to talk about development in 3 different areas. We're going to focus our attention in the very beginning on the class on what we call biological processes, changes that are going on in our nervous system and things that are kind of connected to our minds. After we address some of those biological processes, we'll move on to the next section where we focus our attention on cognitive changes, mental skills and things related to those mental skills that are altered throughout our lifespan. And lastly, we'll spend some time looking at changes in what we call socio-emotional processes, things like traits, identity, our belief in morality. How these things alter is going to be our focus in the very last portion of the class. But I also want to point out, as this Venn diagram indicates, that when we look at these things, we don't want to consider them as completely distinct from each other. There's a lot of overlap between all of them. As we talk about changes in biological processes, it's important to recognize that things happening in our mind and in our environment can greatly impact the unfolding process that happens to our body. And when we talk about cognitive changes, understanding the physical world inside of us gives us a much better understanding of the cognitive changes that we see unfolding on the surface. And understanding the social events that can impact how our cognitive changes unfold is equally critical. And this also in turn works for our socially emotional changes. As our body changes, as our mind changes, our understanding of ourself, our environment, and all the things relating to it also alter. So even though we're going to tackle each of these things as unique entities, understanding how they overlap is another critical thing I want you to get as we progress through this class. Now, I'm guessing some of you might be thinking to yourselves, wait a second. If we're talking about these three separate entities, how are we going to do this in a developmental class? Well, what we'll try to do within each module is focus on a specific topic within each of these three different branches. So in biological processes, we'll talk about things like genetics and physical change, and then we'll transition to things like how the brain and nervous system changes, senses change, and we'll do it by looking at the transition from usually the prenatal period, conception, all the way until the end of our life, what we often call late adulthood. And we'll do this for each and every section, essentially taking a journey from infancy to adulthood in every single class at least once. Sometimes you'll see, because we'll cover multiple topics, we'll do it multiple times within each module. And hopefully that'll give us a more coherent picture of how all these things work, and when we start tying them all together, you can start to see that the very broad world that developmental psychologists have looked at over the span of the 70, 80, well actually 90 years now, the developmental psychologist has really been a focus of interest for researchers. Now, one last thing I'd also like to address before we move on is this notion that age is merely a chronological thing in developmental psychology research. Even though oftentimes we do have to quantify a person's age just by asking them merely how many years old they are based on conception, or months or weeks, whatever metric we're using, it's really important to understand that when we start comparing individuals and their skills, many researchers in developmental psychology have contended that we should also consider not just a person's chronological age, but where they are on the three different areas that we talked about previously. Many people have said, look, your chronological age might be something, but if we look at changes in your body, things that are happening, your physical changes, alterations, or biological age might be more aligned with a different chronological age group. And if somebody knows what their biological age is, that might give them much better insights as to kind of where they are and what should they expect as their personal unfolding continues. The same thing goes for cognitive ages and social ages of individuals. Oftentimes, most people do follow a traditional trajectory, but there's always individuals. They're a little bit ahead of their physical peers in terms of chronological age, and their physical peers in terms of the kind of world around them, either in cognitive skills or in social skills on one or two different dimensions of social age. These things, when we consider them, again, gives us a much clearer picture of how to understand the person as a whole. Well, with that mouthful said, and hopefully there being some clarity within that mouthful, I think this is a good place to wrap up. Just so you understand where we're going, in our next class, we are going to be starting down that journey of what we talked about earlier, those biological changes that we undergo throughout our lifespan. In particular, we're going to focus our attention in the next lecture on physical changes that are happening in the body and the genetic components linked to those physical changes. If you're a bio major, this will be a pretty straightforward topic, but if you are not familiar with biological psychology topics, you might find that this is a little daunting. Don't forget, you do have the ability to pause. You do have the ability to review the readings and other sources. So I promise we'll eventually all get there to the end. But just know, going into it, this is a bit dense, but it's a really critical topic to understand, and it'll give us a much better understanding of some of the stuff that we'll be discussing as we move forward. So for now, Thank you very much for sticking it through, and hopefully I'll see all of you very soon in our next topic of biological development and genetics. Take care.